One night, a president is seized in his own capital. By the next morning, oil markets, drug routes, and regional power balances are all trembling. And just days later, the President of the United States invites another Latin American leader to the White House, not as an enemy, but as a guest. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what you are watching unfold right now is not chaos. It is strategy. Donald Trump insults Colombia's president, threatens force, praises cocaine raids, and then quietly praises his tone and schedules a meeting. This is not contradiction. It is leverage. Power today doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in shocks, pauses, and sudden reversals. If you want to understand where this is heading and why it matters to you, stay with me. Because this moment is not about Venezuela or Colombia alone. It's about how the world is being reshaped one shock at a time. And to see that clearly, we need to step back and define the real problem first. So, what exactly is the problem we are looking at? At first glance, it appears simple. A US president targets drugs. A Latin American region reacts. A Venezuelan leader is seized. A Colombian president is warned, then invited. But that surface story hides the real tension. This is not merely about cocaine. And it is not only about oil. It is about control, who exerts it, who resists it, and who pays the price in between. The United States frames the crisis as a fight against trafficking and instability. Colombia insists it is already fighting that war. Venezuela calls the intervention a historic rupture. And behind all of them sits energy, oil reserves, market access, and leverage over supply. Each side speaks a different language. Security, sovereignty, survival. When these languages collide, diplomacy becomes volatile and force becomes tempting. To understand why this confrontation reached this point and why it exploded so suddenly, we need to look backward before we look forward. Because none of this began last week. To understand how we arrived here, we have to talk about cycles, not personalities. For decades, the United States has returned to the same playbook in the region. Drugs create instability. Instability justifies pressure. Pressure becomes sanctions. Sanctions eventually invite force. Colombia sits at the center of this cycle, a hub for cocaine routes, a country rich in oil and minerals, a strategic partner and a perpetual suspect. When cocaine production rises, Washington reacts. When it explodes, as US officials say, the response hardens. Sanctions follow, diplomatic language sharpens. Venezuela follows a parallel arc. Oil-rich, politically defiant, increasingly isolated. What changed this time was speed. Warnings turned into action. Rhetoric turned into raids. Control over Venezuelan oil became indefinite, not temporary. History shows us something uncomfortable. When drugs, energy, and power converge, restraint rarely lasts. And that brings us to the first real rupture, the moment when pressure crossed into open shock. The rupture came at night. US forces stormed Caracas and seized Nicolás Maduro, a sitting president inside his own compound. By morning, the numbers told a darker story. Not dozens, but more than 100 people killed, according to Venezuela's interior minister. Soldiers, guards, lives erased in a single operation. This was not a warning. This was not deterrence. This was regime removal, fast, decisive, irreversible, and the message traveled instantly. To Caracas, it said defiance has a cost. To Bogotá, it said don't assume you are immune. To the world, it said the rules have changed. If you're still watching, pause and ask yourself why this matters. Because once a president can be taken by force, no alliance feels permanent. Trump's language hardened. He called Colombia's leader a sick man. He implied his time was short, and yet just days later came the call. The softer tone, the invitation to Washington, that whiplash was not confusion. It was design, and to understand it, we have to look beneath the explosion into the machinery that made it possible. What you're seeing here is not impulse. It is a system at work. The mechanism is simple but powerful. First, drugs provide moral cover. They turn geopolitics into law enforcement. They transform intervention into public safety. Second, sanctions tighten the vice. They weaken governments economically while isolating them diplomatically. Pressure builds quietly, invisibly. Third, energy becomes the prize. Oil isn't just fuel, it's leverage. Control oil, and you influence markets, allies, and timelines. This is why Venezuela matters. And it's why Colombia matters just as much. Both sit on oil, both sit on routes, drugs, trade, power. Trump's shift from insult to invitation follows this logic. Threaten to demonstrate force, then offer dialogue from a position of dominance. It's coercive diplomacy, not negotiation among equals, but bargaining after shock. This system doesn't need occupation. It needs fear, dependency, and choice under pressure. And once activated, it rarely stops with one country, because mechanisms like this always seek their next test. Then came the second surge, quieter, but just as dangerous. After the raid, the battlefield shifted from streets to statements. From gunfire to oil flows, the White House announced it would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, not temporarily, not conditionally, indefinitely. That single word changed everything. Oil is Venezuela's lifeline, and now it was being held outside its control. At the same time, Trump sharpened his rhetoric toward Colombia, calling its president a drug maker, suggesting his days were numbered. This is escalation without troops, a squeeze instead of a strike. Markets feel it. Governments calculate it. Leaders panic over it, because once energy becomes a weapon, every country with reserves becomes vulnerable. Colombia heard the message clearly. Petro warned of arms. He invoked the people's jaguar. But warnings are not power. Power is deciding who sells oil and who waits. This second crisis didn't explode. It tightened. And when pressure tightens this way, the real impact isn't felt by presidents first. It's felt by people, and this is where you enter the story. Because when presidents trade threats and oil becomes leverage, it is not leaders who absorb the shock first. It is ordinary people. If you live in Colombia, this means uncertainty. Jobs tied to energy, communities caught between cartels and crackdowns, a future that feels negotiated somewhere far away. If you live in Venezuela, it means something even starker. Sanctions tighten, oil money stalls, basic stability slips further out of reach. You don't vote on oil controls. You don't authorize raids. Yet your cost of living, your safety, your dignity all become collateral. This is the quiet cruelty of power politics. It speaks in strategy, but lands as anxiety. If this analysis helps you see the system more clearly, take a moment to share it. Not to inflame anger, but to spread understanding. Because when people understand the forces shaping their lives, fear loses some of its grip. And once fear weakens, something else begins to emerge. To see that, we need to widen the lens beyond borders, beyond Latin America, to the global consequences now unfolding. When power moves this way in one region, it never stays contained. What happens in Caracas and Bogotá sends ripples far beyond Latin America. Energy markets watch closely. If one country's oil can be controlled indefinitely, others reassess their security overnight. Producers hedge, buyers diversify, prices react not to supply, but to fear. Allies take notes. If partnership can turn into pressure this quickly, loyalty becomes conditional. Diplomacy grows transactional. Trust thins. Rivals, too, are paying attention. They see a model of influence that avoids long wars and favors short shocks. Control without occupation. Force followed by negotiation. This is how global norms erode, not with declarations, but with precedents. The seizure of one president, the sanctioning of another, the weaponization of oil, together they redraw invisible lines of what is acceptable. And once those lines move, they rarely snap back. The world becomes less predictable, more reactive, more fragile, which brings us to the hardest question of all. If this is the new pattern of power, where does it lead? Because from here, the future no longer has just one path. From this point forward, three futures begin to take shape. The first is the optimistic one. Dialogue holds. The meeting at the White House lowers the temperature. Pressure remains, but force recedes. Oil becomes bargaining chip, not weapon. Stability, fragile, imperfect, is preserved. The second future is muddled. Talks happen, but distrust dominates. Sanctions languor. Rhetoric stays sharp. Neither side escalates fully, yet no one steps back. A permanent state of tension sets in, costly, exhausting, corrosive. And then there is the darkest path. Shock becomes precedent. Seizing leaders becomes normalized. Oil control becomes routine. Threats replace institutions. In that world, sovereignty is conditional. Power belongs not to those with legitimacy, but to those who can apply pressure fastest. History teaches us this. Systems built on coercion appear stable until suddenly they are not. The question is not which future is possible. All three are. The question is which incentives we choose to reinforce. And that choice, whether we admit it or not, is being made right now. Because the way this story ends will depend on what we decide power is for. So let me leave you with this. What we are witnessing is not just a confrontation between nations. It is a test of how power is exercised in a fragile world. Trump's approach, shock first, dialogue later, is effective in the short term. It creates leverage. It forces attention. It produces meetings, but it also carries a cost. Every time force precedes trust, institutions weaken. Every time oil becomes a weapon, markets harden. Every time fear replaces norms, the future narrows. The question you should ask is not whether this strategy works. It often does. The real question is what kind of world it builds. One where order is maintained through pressure, or one where stability comes from restraint. If you found this analysis valuable, stay with me. Share it, because the next chapter of this story is already forming and it won't be confined to Latin America. This is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of the next one.